The crystal chandeliers of the azure room scattered the evening light, but the silence that suddenly fell over the dining floor was deafening. Benjamin knelt on the imported marble, her uniform soaked in the $5,000 Bordeaux she had allegedly just spilled. Above her, socialite Sylvia Carmichael sneered, her voice dripping with venom as she demanded Benjamin's immediate termination in front of tech billionaire Richard Sterling. Benjamin's dignity was in shreds, her hands shaking as the restaurant manager prepared to throw her out. But the agonizing humiliation was violently interrupted by a small, trembling voice. The 5-year-old boy sitting beside the billionaire slipped from his mahogany chair, walked past the shattered glass, looked directly into Benjamin's tear-stained face, and whispered, "Mum?" The Azure Room was not merely a restaurant. It was a theater for Manhattan's untouchable elite. Located on the top floor of a gleaming glass skyscraper, it offered a panoramic view of a city that systematically chewed up the weak and rewarded the ruthless. Inside, the air smelled of white truffles, aged leather, and old money. For the patrons, it was a sanctuary of luxury. For Benjamin Jenkins, it was a beautifully decorated purgatory. Benjamin stood by the service station, her black uniform pressed to perfection, her dark hair pulled back into a severe, immaculate bun. Her feet, encased in sensible rubber-soled shoes, throbbed with the familiar dull ache of a double shift. She was 26, though the deep exhaustion etched around her hazel eyes made her look years older. As she polished a crystal wine glass with a microfiber cloth, her mind drifted away from the clinking silverware and low, sophisticated murmurs of the dining room. Earlier that afternoon, standing in the freezing rain outside her cramped Queens apartment, Benjamin had taken a phone call from William Bradley, a private investigator she could barely afford. For 5 years, every tip, every spare dollar, and every waking moment had been funneled into Bradley's bank account. "I've hit another wall, Benjamin." Bradley's raspy voice had crackled through the cheap speaker of her phone. "The records from St. Jude's from that night, they're gone. The server wiped them, and the hard files were lost in a flood in the basement archives 3 years ago. Dr. Aris retired and moved to an unlisted address in Europe. I'm sorry, kid. You might have to face facts. The hospital said your baby didn't make it. Maybe you need to stop chasing a ghost." "He didn't die," Benjamin had told herself, biting her lip so hard she tasted copper. "I heard him cry, a strong, loud cry, and then they put him to sleep and they took him away." "Benjamin, stop daydreaming. Table 4 is yours. And God help you if you mess it up." The sharp hiss of Philip, the notoriously cruel floor manager, snapped Benjamin back to reality. Philip was a wiry man whose entire existence revolved around bowing to the rich and stepping on his staff. Table 4? Benjamin swallowed hard. Table 4 was the prime real estate of the Azure Room, a secluded booth tucked away by the floor-to-ceiling windows offering ultimate privacy. "Richard Sterling," Philip whispered urgently, adjusting his silk tie as if the billionaire were already looking at him. "CEO of Sterling Vanguard. His net worth is higher than the GDP of several small countries. He's dining with his fiancée, Sylvia Carmichael, of the Carmichael banking fortune. And there's a child with them. Richard's adopted son, Leo. I want flawless service, Benjamin, invisible, silent, and perfect. If Sylvia finds a single water spot on her silverware, you'll be out on the street before dessert." Benjamin nodded simply, grabbing her order pad. She knew of Richard Sterling. The man was a regular fixture on financial magazine covers, known for his cold, calculating acquisitions and icy demeanor. He was notoriously private about his personal life, though the tabloids occasionally caught glimpses of him with Sylvia, a woman renowned in high society for her impeccable style and blistering temper. Taking a deep breath, Benjamin smoothed her apron and approached the table. As she neared, the dynamics of the trio became instantly clear. Richard sat rigid in his tailored charcoal suit, his eyes glued to a glowing tablet resting beside his plate. His jawline was sharp, his expression unreadable. Across from him sat Sylvia Carmichael, a striking blonde draped in a custom white silk gown that clung to her like a second skin. Diamonds sparkled at her throat and wrists, catching the ambient light. But it was the child who gave Benjamin pause. Sitting quietly beside Richard was a little boy, no older than 5. He wore a miniature navy blazer and a tiny bow tie. His dark hair was neatly parted, but his eyes, wide, solemn, and heartbreakingly sad, stared blankly at the untouched coloring book in front of him. He looked like a porcelain doll, positioned perfectly, but entirely devoid of life. Benjamin felt a sudden, inexplicable tightness in her chest. A phantom pain she had carried for half a decade flared to life, a mother's instinct mourning a child she had never been allowed to hold. "Good evening," Benjamin said, her voice perfectly modulated, stepping into their periphery. "Welcome to the Azure Room. My name is Benjamin, and I will be taking care of you tonight. May I start you off with some sparkling water or perhaps a cocktail?" Sylvia slowly turned her head, looking Benjamin up and down with the kind of disdain usually reserved for something scraped off the bottom of a shoe. "We'll have the San Pellegrino. Ice, no lemon. The lemons here always taste artificial," she drawled, her tone dripping with boredom. She didn't look at Benjamin, she addressed the air between them. "And bring a glass of milk for the boy. Not cold, room temperature." "Right away, Ma'am," Benjamin murmured. "Richard, darling, are you going to stare at those quarterly reports all night?" Sylvia asked, her voice dropping an octave into a forced, breathy purr. Richard didn't look up. "The Tokyo merger is closing in 4 hours, Sylvia. It requires my attention." Sylvia huffed, crossing her arms. "We are supposed to be discussing the wedding. The planners need a decision on the floral arrangements by tomorrow." Benjamin bowed her head and slipped away. Grateful to escape the suffocating tension of the table, she fetched the water and the milk, moving with the practiced grace of a ghost. When she returned, she placed the drinks down with absolute precision. As she set the room temperature milk beside the little boy, he looked up at her. Benjamin froze. Up close, Leo's eyes were a startling, shifting hazel, a rare combination of green, gold, and brown. They were the exact uncanny mirror of her own eyes. For a split second, time seemed to suspend. The boy blinked, staring at Benjamin not with the detachment of a wealthy child, but with a profound, almost desperate curiosity. "What are you staring at?" Sylvia snapped, shattering the moment. Benjamin jolted, nearly knocking over the water glass. "Take our order, or do I need to explain the menu to you?" "My apologies," Benjamin said quickly, pulling out her notepad. For the next hour, Benjamin endured a masterclass in psychological torture. Sylvia was impossible to please. The amuse-bouche was sent back because the caviar was too pedestrian. She complained that Benjamin was hovering too closely, then moments later loudly sighed that the service was neglectful. She demanded the ambient music be turned down, then complained the room was too quiet. Through it all, Richard remained entirely detached, interjecting only to order his steak rare and his scotch neat. He was oblivious to his fiancée's cruelty, or perhaps, Benjamin thought bitterly, he just didn't care. He treated Benjamin with the same indifference he treated the furniture. But Leo watched Benjamin. Every time she approached the table, the boy's gaze tracked her movements. He didn't speak. According to the gossip among the waitstaff in the kitchen, Richard's adopted son was a selective mute. He hadn't spoken a word since Richard formally adopted him 3 years ago. Yet, whenever Benjamin poured water or cleared a plate, she felt the weight of the child's solemn eyes on her, anchoring her to the present moment, keeping her from breaking under Sylvia's relentless barrage. By the time the main courses were cleared, Benjamin's nerves were frayed to the breaking point. Her knuckles were white from gripping her serving tray so tightly. She retreated to the kitchen, leaning against the cool stainless steel of the prep counter, closing her eyes for just 3 seconds. "They ordered the Chateau Margaux 2009, Philip hissed, appearing out of nowhere and shoving a dusty, incredibly expensive bottle of red wine into her hands. $5,200. Do not shake it. Do not mess up the cork. Decant it at the table. If you spill a single drop, Benjamin, I will garnish your wages until the end of the century." "I know how to pour wine, Philip," Benjamin said, her voice tight. "Just get it done," he sneered. "Sylvia Carmichael is already complaining about your dreary disposition. Smile." Benjamin forced her face into a pleasant, vacant mask, picked up the silver tray holding the wine and crystal decanter, and marched back into the lion's den. At table 4, the atmosphere had deteriorated. Richard had finally put his tablet down, and he and Sylvia were locked in a terse, hushed argument. "I don't understand why the boy needs to be in the wedding party." Sylvia was whispering fiercely, leaning across the table. "He doesn't even speak, Richard. He'll just stand there and look miserable in the photographs. My mother is already having a fit about the optics." Richard's eyes narrowed, a flash of genuine anger breaking through his icy exterior. "Leo is my son, Sylvia. He will stand next to me. The optics be damned." "He's not your blood," Sylvia shot back, her lips thinning into a cruel line. "He's a charity case your brother left behind, and you only took him in because—" "Enough," Richard said. The word wasn't loud, but it carried a terrifying weight. The air at the table turned frigid. Sylvia snapped her mouth shut, her chest heaving with indignation. She hated losing arguments, and she hated being reprimanded even more. Benjamin approached right at that volatile moment. It was terrible timing, but the service protocols of the Azure Room dictated she could not keep a high-paying table waiting for their vintage wine. "Excuse me," Benjamin murmured softly, placing the tray on the serving stand next to Sylvia. "The Chateau Margaux." Benjamin expertly presented the label to Richard, who gave a curt nod. She pulled the cork with a smooth, silent motion, leaving the sediment undisturbed. She poured a small amount into Richard's glass for tasting. He took a sip, nodded again, and returned to glaring at his water glass. "Shall I pour for you, Miss Carmichael?" Benjamin asked. Sylvia didn't answer. She was glaring intensely at Richard, her hands gripping the edge of the table, furious at being shut down. Benjamin took the silence as a yes and carefully lifted the heavy crystal decanter, stepping closer to Sylvia's right side to pour the wine into her glass. It happened in a fraction of a second. As Benjamin tilted the decanter, aiming a perfect stream of ruby-red wine into the bowl of the crystal glass, Sylvia violently threw her right arm back, feigning an exaggerated stretch to emphasize a frustrated sigh. Her elbow slammed solidly into Benjamin's wrist. The impact was sharp. Benjamin gasped as her hand lost its grip on the heavy crystal. The decanter tipped wildly. A river of dark red vintage Bordeaux splashed down. It hit the edge of the table and cascaded directly onto Sylvia's lap, instantly absorbing into the pristine white silk of her custom designer gown. It looked like a horrific spreading wound across the expensive fabric. Time stopped. For one agonizing second, there was no sound. Then Sylvia stood up, her chair screeching violently against the marble floor. "Ah!" Sylvia shrieked, looking down at the ruined dress. The sound pierced through the quiet elegance of the restaurant, causing every head in the dining room to snap toward table 4. Forks paused midway to mouths. The string quartet in the corner faltered and went silent. Benjamin stood frozen in horror, the empty decanter trembling in her hand. "Oh my God," she whispered, panic flooding her veins. "Mom, I am so sorry. I didn't— I bumped you," Sylvia screamed, her face twisting into an ugly mask of pure rage. She grabbed her cloth napkin and dabbed frantically at the stain, which only made it smear into a larger, deeper crimson mess. "You clumsy, stupid, pathetic wretch, look what you've done. Do you have any idea how much this dress costs? It costs more than you make in a decade, you absolute nobody." Benjamin's heart hammered violently against her ribs. She dropped to her knees, instinctively grabbing a handful of clean napkins from her apron, trying to help blot the hem of the dress. "Please, I'm so sorry, let me help." "Get your filthy hands off me," Sylvia shrieked, stepping back and actually kicking out her heel, catching Benjamin in the shin. Benjamin gasped in pain and fell fully onto her hands and knees in the puddle of spilled wine. "Richard," Sylvia demanded, turning to her fiancé, "are you just going to sit there? This idiot just ruined my Oscar de la Renta." Richard looked at Benjamin, kneeling on the floor, surrounded by shattered glass and red wine. His expression was inscrutable. He didn't look angry, just terribly inconvenienced. "Calm down, Sylvia. It's just a dress. The restaurant will pay for the dry cleaning." "Dry cleaning?" Sylvia laughed hysterically. "It's ruined. I want her fired. Right now. I want her fired. I want her blacklisted from every establishment in this city, and I want her arrested for property damage." Benjamin knelt in the wine, her black uniform soaking through, the cold liquid seeping into her skin. The entire restaurant was staring at her. The whispers began, a buzzing hive of wealthy patrons watching a peasant be destroyed for their evening entertainment. Benjamin's chest heaved. She needed this job. She needed the money for the investigator. If she got fired, she couldn't pay rent next week, let alone keep searching for her son. "Please," Benjamin begged, her voice cracking, looking up at Sylvia. The tears she had been fighting back finally spilled over her lashes. "Please, Ms. Carmichael, it was an accident. I have bills. I'm desperate. Please don't take my job." "You should have thought of that before you acted like a drunken mule," Sylvia spat, stepping closer to loom over Benjamin. "You are nothing. You are the help, and you don't belong in the same room as me." "What is the meaning of this?" Philip, the manager, materialized through the crowd of gaping waiters, his face ashen. He took one look at Sylvia's red-stained dress and the weeping waitress on the floor, and his eyes bulged with sheer panic. "Mr. Sterling, Ms. Carmichael, I am profoundly sorry," Philip grovelled, practically bowing at the waist. "I cannot apologize enough for this incompetent—" "Save your breath, Philip," Sylvia snapped, pointing a manicured finger at Benjamin. "Fire her, now, or Richard and I walk out of here, and I will personally ensure the Azure Room loses its Michelin star." Philip didn't hesitate for a fraction of a second. He turned his vicious glare on Benjamin, who was desperately trying to gather the broken shards of glass with trembling hands. "Benjamin, you are terminated," Philip hissed, his voice cold and loud enough for the surrounding tables to hear. "Leave your apron in the kitchen. Don't even bother asking for your final paycheck. It will go toward the cost of the wine you wasted. Get out of my sight. You are a disgrace." The words hit Benjamin like physical blows. Her shoulders slumped. The fight completely drained out of her. The crushing weight of her reality, the poverty, the endless search, the loneliness, and now this public execution of her dignity was too much. She bowed her head, hot tears splashing into the spilled wine. As she leaned forward to push herself up off the floor, the chain of her necklace caught on the collar of her uniform and snapped. A small, cheap silver locket fell from her neck, hitting the marble floor with a sharp clink. It bounced once and popped open. Inside the locket was a tiny, faded sonogram picture. It was the only tangible proof Benjamin had that she had ever been a mother, that her pregnancy wasn't a dream, that the child she had carried for 9 months had existed before the doctors told her he had passed away from sudden complications in the delivery room. Benjamin let out a choked sob and reached out with a wine-stained hand to retrieve the locket. But before her fingers could brush the silver metal, another hand reached out, a tiny, pale hand. Benjamin froze. She looked up through her wet lashes. Little Leo had slid down from his tall, mahogany chair. He had completely ignored Sylvia's screaming, Richard's stern presence, and the manager's yelling. He walked straight through the puddle of expensive wine, staining his tiny polished shoes, and knelt right in front of Benjamin. The dining room went dead silent. Even Sylvia stopped ranting, staring in bewilderment at the boy. Leo picked up the silver locket. He looked at the sonogram picture inside. Then, slowly, he raised his head and looked directly into Benjamin's eyes. Up close, the resemblance was undeniable. Not just the hazel eyes, but the shape of the jaw, the curve of the nose. But what made Benjamin's breath stop entirely in her throat was what she saw as Leo tilted his head. There, on his left earlobe, just below the cartilage, was a tiny dark birthmark in the distinct shape of a star. Benjamin's mind violently snapped back to a sterile, freezing hospital room 5 years ago. The blinding lights, the agony, a baby's cry, a nurse briefly holding the infant near her exhausted face. "He's perfect, honey," the nurse had whispered, pointing to a tiny mark. "Look, he's got a little star on his ear. A lucky boy." 10 minutes later, Dr. Aris rushed in, chaotic shouting, monitors flatlining. "I'm sorry, Ms. Jenkins, he didn't make it." Benjamin stared at the star on the little boy's earlobe. The room spun, the air vanished from her lungs. It was impossible. It was insanity. But the instinct deep in her marrow, the visceral pull that had been drawing her to this child all evening, roared to life. Leo gently placed the locket into Benjamin's open palm. His small fingers curled around hers. He didn't look at her with pity or confusion. He looked at her with a profound, terrifying recognition. His lips parted. He hadn't spoken a single word in 3 years. Therapists had told Richard the boy was deeply traumatized by his early years in the foster system before his adoption. He was mute by choice, locking the world away. But now, staring into the tear-streaked face of a ruined waitress, Leo's chest expanded. "Mom," he whispered. The word wasn't loud, but in the absolute stunned silence of the Azure room, it sounded like a gunshot. Sylvia actually took a step back, her mouth falling open in a grotesque mask of shock. What did he just say?" Philip dropped his clipboard. It clattered loudly against the floor, but nobody looked at him. Richard Sterling, who had spent the last hour treating the room with absolute apathy, suddenly stood up. The color drained completely from his face. He stared at Leo, then slowly shifted his piercing dark eyes to Benjamin, kneeling in the wine. For the first time all evening, the billionaire looked entirely unmoored. Benjamin couldn't breathe. She looked at the boy. Her hands shook violently as she reached up, her wine-stained fingers hovering just inches from his soft cheek. She was terrified that if she touched him, he would shatter like glass, a cruel hallucination brought on by grief and exhaustion. What did you say?" Benjamin choked out, her voice a ragged whisper. Leo leaned his cheek into her trembling palm. The warmth of his skin sent an electrical shock straight into her heart. "Mom," Leo said again, clearer this time, his small arms suddenly wrapping around Benjamin's neck, burying his face into her wet, stained shoulder. He held on to her with a desperate, crushing grip, as if he had been waiting his entire short life for this exact moment. Benjamin collapsed forward, wrapping her arms around the small boy, pulling him tightly against her chest. She buried her face in his dark hair, inhaling the scent of him, and let out a wail of raw, unadulterated anguish and joy that tore through the sophisticated veneer of the restaurant. It was the cry of a mother who had walked through hell and finally found her way back to the light. Above them, Sylvia broke the spell. "Richard," she shrieked, her voice pitched in hysteria. "Get him away from her. She's filthy. The boy is confused. Pull him off her this instant." Richard didn't move to help Sylvia. He didn't move to grab his son. He stood completely still, staring down at Benjamin with an expression that shifted rapidly from shock to confusion to a terrifying dawning realization. He looked at the way the waitress held the boy, and then he looked at Sylvia, his eyes narrowing into deadly calculating slits. "Philip," Richard finally spoke, his voice dangerously low, cutting through the murmurs of the crowd like a scythe. Yes, Mr. Sterling," the manager squeaked. "Clear the room," Richard commanded, never taking his eyes off Benjamin and the boy. "Clear the entire restaurant, now." The Azure room emptied with the frantic efficiency of a sinking ship. Philip, terrified of the billionaire's icy command, had practically shoved the remaining patrons out the mahogany doors, comping thousands of dollars in meals to ensure absolute privacy. The string quartet had fled. The busboys had vanished. Only 4 people remained in the center of the vast, chandelier-lit room. Benjamin knelt on the floor, still clutching the little boy. Leo's face was buried in her neck, his small hands gripping the fabric of her ruined uniform with astonishing strength. He was breathing heavily, a slight tremor running through his tiny frame, but he refused to let go. Benjamin rocked him gently, her tears cutting tracks through the dust and makeup on her face. She didn't care about the wine. She didn't care about Philip or her job. She only cared about the steady heartbeat thumping against her chest. A few feet away, Sylvia Carmichael paced like a caged panther, her ruined Oscar de la Renta gown swishing angrily around her ankles. "This is absolute madness, Richard," she hissed, her voice echoing in the cavernous room. "She is a grifter, a highly manipulative con artist who probably read about Thomas's adoption in the tabloids and staged this entire pathetic spectacle to extort you." Richard Sterling stood completely still. He had unbuttoned his suit jacket, his hands shoved deep into his pockets. His dark, analytical eyes were fixed intently on Benjamin and the boy. He ignored Sylvia entirely. "What is your name?" Richard asked. His voice was no longer a command. It was a low, careful rumble, devoid of its previous apathy. Benjamin looked up, her hazel eyes meeting his. She tightened her protective grip on Leo. Benjamin Jenkins." "Benjamin Jenkins," Richard repeated, tasting the name. He took a slow step forward. "My son has not uttered a single syllable in 3 years. Top child psychologists in Manhattan, specialists from Johns Hopkins, none of them could coax a word from him. Yet he looks at a waitress he has never met, and he calls her Mom. Explain that to me, Ms. Jenkins. I... Benjamin's voice shook, but she forced herself to meet his imposing gaze. I didn't stage anything. 5 years ago, I gave birth at St. Jude's Medical Center in Boston. It was a chaotic night. A massive storm had knocked out the auxiliary power in the maternity ward. I heard my baby cry. A strong, healthy cry. The nurse showed him to me for just a few seconds. I saw the birthmark on his ear. She gently brushed the hair back from Leo's ear to reveal the tiny star-shaped mark. Then the alarms went off. Dr. Arthur Pendleton rushed in. They put me under. When I woke up, they told me my baby had suffered a massive respiratory failure. They told me he was dead. Sylvia let out a harsh, mocking laugh. Oh, brilliant. A dead baby story. How incredibly original. Richard, call your security team and have this tramp thrown into a police cruiser. I am sick of looking at her. Sylvia, if you speak one more time, the wedding is off, Richard stated, his tone so flat and devoid of emotion that it was terrifying. Sylvia froze, her mouth snapping shut, her face flushing an ugly mottled red. Richard crouched down, bringing himself to eye level with Benjamin. The sheer presence of the man was overwhelming, a localized force of wealth and power. But Benjamin didn't flinch. If your child died in Boston 5 years ago, Richard said softly, why are you wearing a locket with a sonogram? And why did you look at my son as if you recognized him before he dropped the necklace? Because a mother knows, Benjamin said fiercely, a sudden surge of adrenaline steadying her voice. And because I never believed them. For 5 years, I've paid a private investigator, William Bradley, every spare cent I have to dig into St. Jude's. The hospital records from that night were scrubbed. Dr. Pendleton retired abruptly and vanished. They wouldn't let me see the body, Mr. Sterling. They claimed it was a closed casket cremation due to medical protocols. I've been hunting a ghost because my gut told me they stole him. Richard stared at her. His mind, trained to process complex corporate mergers and spot microscopic flaws in contracts, raced through the variables. Leo was adopted by my older brother, Thomas Sterling, 5 years ago, Richard explained, his eyes briefly flickering with a buried grief. Thomas and his wife utilized a highly exclusive private agency in Massachusetts. They were told the mother was a drug addict who had abandoned the child at a fire station. 2 years ago, Thomas and his wife died in a private aviation accident off the coast of Nantucket. I took Leo in. He has been mute ever since the crash. Benjamin gasped, pulling Leo slightly closer. He's been through so much. He has, Richard agreed, his voice tight. He stood up, pulling a sleek black smartphone from his pocket. I am a man who deals in facts, Ms. Jenkins. Not maternal intuition, not miracles. If what you are saying is true, it implies a criminal conspiracy of astronomical proportions involving a prominent medical institution and my late brother's estate. I am going to make a phone call to my head of security, David Cole. We are going upstairs to my private office. I'm not letting him go, Benjamin said immediately, her tone brokering absolutely no argument. Richard looked at the boy, who was still clinging to Benjamin like a life raft. A strange, unreadable emotion crossed the billionaire's face. I wouldn't ask you to, Richard said. He turned to his furious fiancée. Sylvia, have your driver take you home. I will deal with you tomorrow. You are choosing the delusions of a spilled wine peasant over me, Sylvia shrieked, her aristocratic veneer completely shattering. My family's bank holds the primary debt on your Tokyo merger, Richard. You cannot humiliate me like this. Watch me, Richard replied coldly. The Sterling Vanguard corporate suite occupied the entire top floor above the Azure Room. It was a fortress of steel and glass, fortified by biometric scanners and silent, heavily armed security personnel. Benjamin sat on a plush white leather sofa in Richard's cavernous office, looking wildly out of place in her ruined, wine-stained uniform. Leo sat right beside her, his small hand firmly interlocked with hers. He hadn't spoken another word, but the profound, suffocating tension that usually radiated from the boy had vanished. He leaned against Benjamin's side, his breathing slow and even, painting a picture of absolute peace. Across the mahogany desk, Richard Sterling was operating with terrifying efficiency. He had David Cole, a hulking man with a military bearing and an earpiece, standing by the door. On the speakerphone sat William Bradley, Benjamin's gruff, exhausted private investigator whom Richard's team had tracked down and woken up in a matter of minutes. "Say that again, Bradley," Richard commanded, tapping a gold pen against his desk. Through the speaker, the PI's voice crackled, laced with disbelief. "I said, I finally managed to trace the shell company that funded Dr. Arthur Pendleton's retirement account in the Caymans. I've been hitting a brick wall for 2 years, but your security guys just gave me access to offshore routing numbers I could only dream of." "And the name of the shell company?" Richard pressed. "Lighthouse Holdings," Bradley replied, "but it's not a standalone. It's a subsidiary of a private wealth management trust, the Carmichael Group." Benjamin's breath hitched. She looked at Richard. The billionaire's face had turned to stone. "Sylvia's family," Benjamin whispered, the pieces violently clicking together in her mind. "Explain the connection, Bradley," Richard said, his voice dropping to a dangerous register. "It looks like an illegal adoption mill, Mr. Sterling," Bradley explained, the grim reality heavy in his tone. "Carmichael Group funded a private agency called the Gilded Cradle. They targeted vulnerable, low-income women at specific hospitals, like St. Jude's. Doctors on their payroll, like Pendleton, would falsely declare the infants deceased. The agency would then broker these untraceable babies to ultra-wealthy clients for exorbitant fees, bypassing years of legal red tape and background checks. Your brother Thomas paid 7 figures to the Gilded Cradle for Leo." Silence stretched across the penthouse office. Benjamin felt physically sick. They had stolen her baby for profit. They had handed her an empty, agonizing grief so a billionaire could skip a waiting list. "Did my brother know?" Richard asked. It was the first time Benjamin heard actual vulnerability in his voice. "Did Thomas know the child was stolen?" "Unlikely," Bradley said. "These agencies sell the illusion of legality perfectly. They provided forged abandonment documents. Thomas probably thought he was rescuing an orphan." Richard exhaled slowly, pinching the bridge of his nose. The sheer magnitude of the betrayal was staggering. "And Sylvia? What is her connection to the Gilded Cradle?" "That's where it gets interesting," Bradley noted. "Sylvia Carmichael sat on the board of Lighthouse Holdings 5 years ago. She oversaw the disbursement of funds to the medical personnel. She knew exactly what the business model was." Benjamin looked down at Leo. Sylvia had been complaining about the boy being in the wedding photos. She had treated him with absolute disdain. It wasn't just because he was adopted. It was because he was a living, breathing piece of evidence of her family's dark criminal enterprise. She recognized the hospital, Benjamin realized out loud, looking up at Richard. "When I mentioned St. Jude's downstairs and the timeline, she knew. That's why she wanted me arrested immediately. She wasn't just being cruel, she was trying to eliminate a liability." Richard's eyes locked onto Benjamin. The cold, unfeeling billionaire she had served an hour ago was entirely gone. In his place was a man who realized he had brought a viper into his inner sanctum, a woman who had profited off the destruction of the very boy he had sworn to protect. "Mr. Cole," Richard said, looking at his head of security. "Sir." The large man stepped forward. "Contact the FBI, specifically the white-collar crime and human trafficking divisions. Send them the data file Mr. Bradley just compiled on the Carmichael Group." Richard stood up, his jaw set with lethal intent. "And freeze all of Sterling Vanguard's assets associated with the Carmichael Bank. I want Sylvia's family financially paralyzed by sunrise." "Yes, Mr. Sterling." Cole nodded, turning to leave the room to execute the orders that would undoubtedly shatter Manhattan's financial elite by morning. Richard walked around the desk and approached the sofa. He looked down at Benjamin, noting the exhaustion, the wine stains, and the fierce protective grip she had on his adopted son. "Ms. Jenkins," Richard said softly. "Benjamin." Benjamin looked up, her heart pounding. The truth was out, the villains were exposed. But the most terrifying question remained suspended in the air between them. "What happens now?" Benjamin asked, her voice trembling. He is my son, Mr. Sterling. The blood in his veins is mine. I won't leave without him." Richard looked at the boy. Leo, sensing the shift in the room, looked up at Richard, then looked at Benjamin. He reached his free hand out and grabbed the sleeve of Richard's custom suit, pulling the billionaire slightly closer, connecting the three of them in a tense, silent triad. "I know," Richard said quietly, "and I know that legally the adoption is fraudulent. He is yours." Richard swallowed hard, a flash of profound loss crossing his features. "But for the last 2 years, he has been my entire world. I am the only father he remembers." Benjamin saw the genuine love in the billionaire's eyes, and for the first time that night, she saw him not as a titan of industry, but as a man terrified of losing his child. The sunrise over Manhattan the next morning did not bring the usual hustle of high society brunches and corporate pleasantries. Instead, it brought a reckoning that would dominate the front page of the Wall Street Journal and the New York Times for months to come. At 6 a.m., a fleet of black tactical vehicles bearing the insignia of the Federal Bureau of Investigation descended upon the Carmichael estate in the Hamptons. Simultaneously, agents stormed the glass-paneled lobby of the Carmichael Group's headquarters in the financial district. Sylvia Carmichael, who had spent the night alternating between hysterical crying fits and throwing expensive vases at her staff, was escorted out of her mansion in silk pajamas and handcuffs. The local news helicopters caught the exact moment the impeccably groomed socialite, devoid of her makeup and her haughty demeanor, was pushed into the back of an unmarked federal sedan. Her screams of indignation were muted by the heavy bulletproof glass. Across the city, in the serene, heavily guarded penthouse of the sterling Vanguard Tower, the atmosphere was entirely different. Benjamin awoke in a guest bedroom that was larger than her entire queen's apartment. The sheets were high thread count Egyptian cotton, but she had barely slept. She had spent the entire night watching Leo breathe. The little boy had refused to let go of her hand, even in his sleep, and had curled into her side, a warm, anchoring weight that finally banished the 5-year-long winter in Benjamin's soul. When she finally emerged into the sprawling living area, dressed in a set of soft, borrowed cashmere loungewear, she found Richard standing by the floor-to-ceiling windows. He was already in a fresh suit, holding a cup of black coffee, watching the news on a muted flat-screen television. The ticker at the bottom read, "Carmichael Heiress arrested in multi-million-dollar adoption ring scandal." "It's over," Richard said softly, hearing her footsteps. He turned to face her. The dark circles under his eyes mirrored her own, but there was a profound sense of relief in his posture. Dr. Arthur Pendleton was apprehended at an airport in Geneva 3 hours ago. The Gilded Cradle's assets have been seized, and Sylvia, he gestured to the television. She is currently sitting in a federal holding cell, facing charges of fraud, racketeering, and child trafficking. Benjamin exhaled a shaky breath, crossing her arms over her chest. "She ruined so many lives, Richard, just so wealthy people wouldn't have to wait." "And I inadvertently funded it," Richard said, his voice laced with heavy guilt. "When Thomas died, I just took over Leo's care. I never looked at the paperwork. I never questioned the agency. I was so consumed with grief over my brother that I failed to see the crime sitting right in front of me." "You couldn't have known," Benjamin said gently, stepping closer. "You loved him. You protected him. You gave him a home when he had no one else. Sylvia knew the truth, and she treated him like an accessory. You treated him like a son." Richard looked at her, his icy billionaire persona completely dismantled. "The DNA test we expedited last night came back an hour ago, Benjamin. It's a 99.9% match. He is your biological child. Legally, my adoption of him is void because it was predicated on forged documents." Benjamin's heart stopped. She had her baby back. The nightmare was truly over. But as she looked at Richard, she saw the devastation he was trying desperately to hide. He was a man who had just lost his fiancée, his brother a few years prior, and was now facing the legal loss of the child he had raised. "Are you going to fight me in court?" Benjamin asked quietly, her maternal instincts bracing for a war she knew she couldn't financially win. Richard shook his head immediately. "No. I have a team of lawyers currently drafting a petition to Judge Harrison of the family court. We are transferring full legal custody to you. I will not subject you or Leo to a legal battle. You have suffered enough." He paused, swallowing hard. I only ask that you don't cut me out of his life completely. I know I have no right to ask it. But I love him, Benjamin." Before Benjamin could answer, the soft padding of small feet echoed against the hardwood floor. Leo emerged from the hallway. He was rubbing his eyes, his dark hair tousled from sleep. He looked at Richard, then looked at Benjamin. For a moment, the heavy silence of the past 3 years seemed to hang in the air. Then Leo walked directly to the center of the room. He reached out with his left hand and grabbed Benjamin's fingers. He reached out with his right hand and grabbed Richard's. "Hungry," Leo said, his voice raspy from disuse, but loud and clear in the quiet penthouse. He looked up at Richard. "Dad." Then he looked up at Benjamin. "Mom." A choked sob escaped Richard's throat. He dropped to his knees, pulling the boy into a fierce, desperate hug. Benjamin knelt beside them, wrapping her arms around both the billionaire and the son she thought she had lost forever. The three of them held onto each other, an unconventional, fractured family forged in the fires of a devastating conspiracy, finally finding peace. The transition from the ruined floor of the Azure Room to a functioning, healthy family was not a fairy tale instantly fixed by the stroke of a billionaire's pen. It was a complex, fragile labyrinth of legal battles, intense psychological therapy, and the slow, deliberate rebuilding of trust. Benjamin did not return to her cramped, drafty apartment in Queens. Within 48 hours of the revelation in the penthouse, Richard Sterling had utilized the terrifying, unchecked power of his wealth to alter the fabric of Benjamin's reality. He placed her and Leo in a sprawling, light-filled brownstone on the Upper West Side, complete with a private courtyard and a state-of-the-art security system. He established a blind trust in Benjamin's name, ensuring that the woman who had scrubbed floors and endured the cruelty of the elite would never have to look at a price tag or a past due notice again. But wealth could not instantly erase trauma. For the first 3 months, Leo suffered from debilitating night terrors. He would wake up screaming, thrashing against invisible restraints, terrified that the sterile hospital lights or the cold, indifferent walls of his early foster homes had returned to claim him. During those dark hours, the billionaire and the former waitress formed an unspoken, unbreakable alliance. Richard, who previously measured his time in fiscal quarters and global mergers, entirely restructured his life. He stepped back from the daily operations of Sterling Vanguard, appointing a trusted board member as acting CEO. When Leo screamed at 2 in the morning, Richard was there, arriving at Benjamin's brownstone in sweatpants and a rumpled t-shirt, completely devoid of his corporate armor. Together, they would sit on the edge of Leo's bed. Benjamin would hold the boy against her chest, singing soft, off-key lullabies, while Richard would read heavily illustrated encyclopedias about marine biology, Leo's new obsession, until the boy's breathing leveled out and he drifted back to sleep. It was in these quiet, desperate hours that Benjamin truly saw the man behind the myth. Richard was not the apathetic titan she had served at table 4. He was a man who carried a profound, heavy capacity for love, a man who had been suffocated by the expectations of his legacy and the grief of losing his brother. As the seasons changed, so did Leo. The selective mutism, which had been a fortress to protect him from a world that kept shifting under his feet, began to crumble. With Benjamin's unwavering, fierce maternal presence and Richard's quiet, steady devotion, Leo realized he was finally safe. He started with single words, asking for juice, pointing out a dog in Central Park, naming the colors of the autumn leaves. By the time spring arrived, he was speaking in complete, rapid-fire sentences, his natural curiosity exploding to the surface. He was brilliant, observant, and possessed a dry, sharp sense of humor that mirrored Richard's perfectly. Benjamin, too, found a new version of herself. She refused to simply exist as a wealthy man's dependent or a passive survivor. The fierce, relentless determination that had driven her to hire private investigators while surviving on minimum wage was now given a focused, lethal direction. She enrolled at Columbia University, utilizing her newfound stability to pursue a degree in social work and legal advocacy. She wanted to dismantle the very systems that had allowed the gilded cradle to operate in the shadows. She spent her days studying family law, child welfare policies, and corporate accountability. Richard became her fiercest sounding board, using his intimate knowledge of corporate loopholes and shell companies to help her trace how institutions hid their negligence. They would sit at the massive oak dining table in the brownstone, covered in legal textbooks and highlighted case studies, debating ethics over takeout boxes of spicy Thai noodles. They had become a united, formidable front. To the outside world, they were an enigma, a devastatingly powerful co-parenting unit that the tabloids could not penetrate. They attended parent-teacher conferences together, standing shoulder to listen to Leo's kindergarten teacher praise his reading level. They celebrated holidays not at lavish galas, but in the brownstone, attempting to bake disastrously misshapen sugar cookies. Yet beneath the comfortable routine of their shared devotion to Leo, a quiet, undeniable shift was occurring between them. The platonic boundaries they had established to protect Leo's stability were beginning to fray under the weight of genuine, deep-seated mutual respect and a growing magnetic attraction. It came to a head on a rainy Tuesday evening in late November, exactly 1 year to the day since the incident at the Azure Room. Benjamin was standing in the kitchen of Richard's penthouse. Leo had just gone to sleep after a chaotic, flour-filled attempt at making homemade pizzas. The sprawling city below was painted in blurred, glowing streaks of amber and crimson through the rain-slicked floor-to-ceiling windows. Benjamin wore a simple, soft cashmere sweater and jeans, her dark hair pulled back in a loose, messy clip. She heard the heavy mahogany door of Richard's home office click shut, followed by his measured footsteps on the hardwood floor. "I just got off the phone with the district attorney," Richard said, walking into the soft, warm light of the kitchen. He looked exhausted but remarkably at peace. He poured 2 glasses of a rich, full-bodied Pinot Noir and handed one to Benjamin. "And?" Benjamin asked, her fingers brushing his as she took the delicate crystal glass. A familiar jolt of electricity traveled up her arm, a sensation she had been diligently trying to ignore for months. "Sylvia formally accepted the federal plea deal," Richard announced, leaning back against the marble island, his dark eyes fixed on her. "She surrendered her shares in the Carmichael Group to a victims' compensation fund. She is looking at a mandatory minimum of 20 years in a maximum security federal penitentiary. Furthermore, the medical board officially revoked the licenses of every doctor associated with St. Jude's who took money from Lighthouse Holdings." Benjamin exhaled a long, shaky breath. She closed her eyes, letting the immense weight of the past 6 years finally slide off her shoulders. The nightmare was truly, permanently over. The mothers who had been told their babies were gone would receive the truth, and the people who had played God for profit were locked away. "It's done," Benjamin whispered, opening her eyes to look at him. "We actually did it." "You did it, Benjamin," Richard corrected her, his voice dropping to a low, incredibly gentle register. "You refused to let a system bury you. You refused to let Philip humiliate you into silence. You brought a multi-billion-dollar empire to its knees because you loved your son." "You helped me," Benjamin insisted, taking a step closer to him. The vast, empty space of the penthouse suddenly felt very small, very intimate. Any other man would have called security. "You listened. You gave up everything you knew to protect us." Richard looked down at her. The icy, untouchable aura of the billionaire was entirely gone, replaced by the raw, open vulnerability of a man who knew exactly what he stood to lose. His gaze traced the line of her jaw, the soft curve of her lips, and the hazel eyes that matched his son's perfectly. "Benjamin," Richard murmured, setting his wine glass down on the counter. He reached out, his large, warm hand gently cupping her face. His thumb brushed against her cheekbone. "We built this family entirely backward. We started with the child, navigated the disaster, tore down a criminal syndicate, and completely skipped the rest." Benjamin's heart hammered a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She didn't pull away. She leaned slightly into his touch, her own hands finding the lapels of his tailored shirt. "Skipped what exactly?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "The part where I ask you out," Richard said, a small, genuine smile breaking across his handsome face. "The part where I take you to a restaurant, not the Azure Room, never there, but somewhere quiet. The part where I tell you that watching you become the center of Leo's world has made you the center of mine. I don't want to just be your co-parent anymore, Benjamin. I want to be the man who stands beside you for the rest of it." Benjamin looked into the eyes of the man who had helped put her shattered world back together. He wasn't a terrifying CEO to her anymore. He was Richard, the man who wore sweatpants at 2 in the morning, the man who read about sharks with funny voices, the man who respected her ambition, fought for her peace, and looked at her as if she were the only woman left on Earth. "Then I think," Benjamin whispered, a radiant smile illuminating her face, "you should probably stop talking and kiss me, Richard." He didn't need to be told twice. Richard closed the final inch between them, capturing her lips in a kiss that erased the last lingering shadows of their past. It wasn't hesitant or cautious, it was a profound, sweeping de-Benjamination of everything they had survived and everything they were about to build. It was the taste of absolute, unwavering promise, a future forged not in the cold transactions of the elite, but in the warm, unbreakable light of a family finally made whole. The story of Benjamin and Richard is a powerful testament to the unbreakable bond between a mother and her child. What began in the depths of public humiliation and profound grief transformed into a relentless pursuit of truth that toppled a syndicate of corruption and greed. The Azure Room incident, initially a stage for cruelty, became the catalyst for justice, proving that the human spirit, especially a mother's intuition, cannot be silenced by wealth or power. Ultimately, this narrative transcends the classic tropes of high society drama. It is a story about the reclamation of dignity, the dismantling of a broken system, and the unexpected ways trauma can forge the strongest of families. Benjamin, Richard, and Leo found their way out of the darkness, demonstrating that love, in all its unconventional forms, is the ultimate equalizer, capable of rewriting even the most tragic of beginnings.